Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty great. Excited to chat
Good.
with you.
Yes, it is so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Thank you for wanting to talk.
Oh my goodness, of course. We were just talking about your books, like my editorial team, because we read Book Lovers last year for our book club, and
Oh,
we've been talking
fun.
about Happy Place since you announced it. So,
Oh my gosh, that's so nice. Oh, that's really sweet.
so I would love to hear kind of to start off. I know that you have kind of talked about weaving different parts of yourself into these books.
Yeah.
And I understand a little bit. I minored in creative writing, so I kind of understand like a little bit of that. And I feel like with book lovers in particular, I'm an older sister. I love books. I grew up in North Carolina, so I've been to the mountains. Like that has such a special connection. Is there any character or book of yours that you feel like more of an inclination to?
I really don't know. I feel like my answer for this is usually whatever the newest book is because it's like such a work of self reflection and
Mm,
investigation. Whenever I'm writing one of these books, it's like the characters are never me, but I'm always taking some facet of myself that I kind of want to spend some time thinking about
yeah.
and working on. And so right now my answer would probably be Harriet. Because it's just like what she's dealing with, what she's trying to figure out about herself is something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about because I've been working on her
Hmm.
story. So she, is a huge people pleaser, and that tendency to try to always keep the peace and to get along with everyone and to never tell anyone no, all of that is sort of this coping mechanism of hers that has helped her get through her life, but is now to the point where it's no longer serving her. And it's actually creating all this friction and all these tensions within her relationships and in her own life. So that
Yeah.
was like something I very specifically knew the character was going to be built around. And it's something that I've been observing in myself and thinking about. But there really is, every book has kind of been that. Like with January in Beach Read, her journey is about kind of feeling like she had been this optimist. She had always
Hmm.
seen the hope in everything and the silver lining, and getting to a point where the world just felt really dark and unsafe and unpredictable, and
Mm.
trying to reconcile her old worldview with this new one and figure out like how she actually sees things. And
Yeah.
that, I think, is like the point that I was at when I wrote that book. And
Mm.
yeah, so I could really, like, all of them I think are being pulled from something that I feel very personally engaged with. And there are things about each of the characters that I'm very attached to and that I recognize in myself. But it's also interesting because, like, at the time, January felt so similar to me. And then as I get older, like, that is more of like a time
Hmm.
capsule in a way.
Yes, I know. And that's such an interesting kind of view of evolution as humans, the way that we kind of change and become different people. And
Yeah.
I love the way that all the characters kind of, or all of the books kind of reference one another. Do you have like an ongoing spider web or reference board in your home that you kind of keep track of like the Emily Henry universe?
I don't, and I'm honestly wondering if at some point I'm going to have to do that to kind of create like a big, like, book that just has all of the little things, because usually it's like it's really easy to connect the new one to whatever I just wrote because it's still somewhat
Hmm.
fresh in my mind and I can kind of remember things. Um but yeah, eventually it might become more of a spider web. So we'll see. I might need the reader's help kind of putting that all together, because it's like you're so immersed in a book when you're writing it, and then
Hmm.
when you
Yeah.
leave it you're just almost straight into the next one. And it honestly, a lot I forget a lot of what happens in my books. So those little Easter eggs are kind of a fun way to me to stay connected to the past books and to remember them.
Yes, it could be like a special grocery list assignment or something
Yes,
that you
right,
send
please
out.
help me. Yeah. help me, document everything. Yeah. Yeah.
So I know that there's comes a point in writing when you're kind of embodying different people where the characters kind of take over and start directing you instead of the other way
Yeah.
around. Was there a particular point in Happy Place where you kind of realized Harriet and Win were just doing their own thing?
Ooh, that is such a good question because I that is so true, and it's also such a relief when that
Mm-hmm.
happens because a lot of times that is not early on in the writing process for me. It's like I am fully steering the ship, and it's not nearly as much fun as it is once the characters are fleshed out enough that their decisions are very easy for me to predict and understand. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I let me think about this. I do remember when there's kind of like a significant scene that's kind of when the first time that Harriet and Win really talk more directly about the end of their relationship and what happened. And um it was so interesting because I didn't really know exactly where it was going, but when Win kind of opens up about like what he was going through, what he was experiencing, it kind of did feel like, oh, on some subconscious level I knew this because looking back,
Mm-hmm.
even in the earlier phases of drafting, looking back I could see that the answer had kind of always been there and that all of the signs were present of kind of where his story was going. But once they had that conversation, so much of it clicked so that when I was doing revision later, that I could see, the kind of the basic movements of his arc. But once I had that piece of it, that first open honest conversation,
Mm-hmm.
it was like so much easier to go back and to edit him and to bring him more forward earlier on so that you could like get to know the character or see like even the yeah, just like I guess just get to know him, just get to anticipate what he would how he would react to something, what he would say, just knowing him well enough to fine tune all of those scenes that they so that they made the most sense possible with the Win that I came to know.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other scenes that I loved in the book is kind of the airport scene at the
Mhm.
end. And I'd love to hear what went into that process of having them run to each other and kind of subverting that trope instead of having just one of them pursuing the other. Because that I feel like it makes it so much more fleshed out.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a tricky scene for me to nail down because so much of Harriet's journey is really internal
Mm-hmm.
um and that's just tricky in general because when something's more external, it's like kind of how the grand gesture should play out. You're like, okay, they failed each other in these ways and here's like here's how what the answer to that would be. Here's how you would like
Mm-hmm.
show that you're past that. Um but Harriet and Win were so tricky because so much of their conflict and so much of the issues and so many of the issues in their relationship were just based on what was going on separately in their heads, like the way that they're perceiving things, the decisions that they're making, thinking that they understand what's happening with the other with with their partner. So for that particular scene, there was some back and forth in drafting where I was trying to figure out what is the grand gesture, who does it come
Mm.
from, and how does it make the most sense. And what I did come to was like this was not one person failing a relationship. It was two people who things broke down between and who both made their own mistakes. And for Harriet it was kind of like trying to pretend that everything was fine and to not
Mm.
ask for what she wanted, and to make things as easy and simple on Win. And for Win it was kind of like just letting his own self-esteem issues and all of that kind of drive him away from Harriet and really convincing himself that she's like better off
Mm-hmm.
on her own. And so they both had to kind of make their own grand gestures um and so yeah, it kind of like I didn't really see a way that I could bring them back together in their like big moment without both of them taking a pretty big risk and doing the thing that they hadn't
Yeah.
done before. So for Harriet, it's like just coming right out and saying, "No, I want this." And that might be an inconvenient truth to you, but you're going to have to be the one to end this or break my heart. Like, I'm not going to let you
Mhm.
let you off just because I'm, like, afraid of confrontation and rocking the boat. I'm telling you I want this, so if it ends, it's because you
Mhm.
won't take the risk, basically. And then for when, like, being willing to just admit that, like, he does want this, he's just afraid he can't make her happy, and, to kind
Mhm.
of face up to that fear.
Yes, and so talking about Harriet's or all of your characters' insecurities, they all kind of deal with different things, and like January's family problems, all of the stories deal with such real complex things that we just face as people. And I know you've talked a little bit in the past about sci-fi and
Mm.
existentialism and kind of using supernatural things to explore that. How does grounding your stories in reality help you explore kind of the existentialism that we can all feel in a different way?
Yeah, well, I think it's specifically grounding it in love, and, like,
Mm,
grounding it in romance that has really worked for me, and that's really an interesting thing to realize because obviously we see a lot of stigma around romance as a genre, and that's changed a lot in the last few
mhm,
years. There have been so many incredible authors, like, who changed my perception of romance as a genre, who made me
mhm,
into a romance reader and a romance writer. So, there is this idea that floats around still outside of the book community that
mhm,
romance is not really a grounded genre, that it's sort of this surface level thing where it's like kind of like a fairy tale, but like not like a dark old fairy tale, like a Disney fairy tale where you're like, no one really believes that this is possible, but this is just like it makes you feel good, and so that's where why people do it, and or like let me think about this. Just yeah, just that it's not real. This idea that it's
yeah,
not real and that it's a different basically kind of fantasy. But the thing that I love about writing romance so much is that when you write two characters falling in love, you are writing two people at their absolute most vulnerable, because
mm,
when you fall in love, you are kind of innately embarrassing. You have to be a little bit fearless in it, which is
mhm,
hard for most of us. You have to, flirting is like very embarrassing. You're like,
the
it's
worst.
everything about it, putting yourself out there. So it's a really, really vulnerable position. And then the other thing
Mhm,
is that as you're falling in love, so much of the process of falling in love is this mutual excavation and kind of this show and tell process is how I think of it, where you've met someone who you're so drawn to that you want to know everything about them. Like, you want to just mainline them, inhale them, and you want them to know everything about you. So there's always that moment you get to the point in a relationship where you're like showing each other your baby pictures, and or taking
mhm,
each other to meet your friends and your family, and it feels like this rush of it, just this is adrenaline rush, and it's so intense the way that you just kind of want to absorb another person and be absorbed by them. And so I think when you're falling in love and you're ex- experiencing that vulnerability and opening yourself up in that way, all of these other things bubble up. And also, like,
mhm,
when you watch people date and fall in love, it's like all of your triggers are also like at an all-time high. I feel like you kind of become very aware of your own trauma based on how you're reacting to the process of falling in love. And so I
mm,
find writing the process of falling in love to be a really easy inroad to exploring a person's mental interiority and their emotional landscape, because
yeah,
everything's so heightened at that point, and all of their fears, all of their past hurts, their trauma, their family relationships, all of it kind of bubbles to the surface by nature of this terrifying experience they're having of trying to open themselves up to another person, or feeling like maybe even unwillingly opened up to another person just because they're being drawn together, and they might not even want to like open up to this person. So yeah, it's like when I loved playing in fantasy and sci-fi and using these heightened versions of our world or other worlds to explore what it is to be like a human. But I also think that nothing really encapsulates what it is to be a human quite like
mhm.
the experience experience of falling in love, and I think it's a really um, great way to explore growth as a growth within a character. It's like a really natural way to get as deep into their head and their heart as you can and to push them through an emotional arc.
Has it changed the way that you kind of view the world at all, or kind of it changed kind of your outward view of the people around you, kind of doing that internal work at all?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I had already been to therapy and everything before I started writing books, but it's so interesting because I think the thing that I've always loved about fiction, like when I really, really love it, it's this incredible thing because you're reading this made up story, but there's something about it that feels so true. And it's like you can be so moved by it. You can truly love these characters who are figments of your
Mhm.
imagination or someone else's imagination, and you can feel changed by a story even
Mm.
though it's not actually happening like in real life. You can feel like it changes you, it changes how you see things, it gives you a new vantage point. And some people really get that out of nonfiction. They're like, I just absorb these facts and that shifts my perspective. But I've always connected the most to story in general. So even if I'm reading nonfiction, it kind of has to be
Same.
couched in like a really great storytelling. So yeah, so from a reading perspective, that's always been the case for me, that reading great fiction changes me. But to now have this process, having done it 4 times now, of writing specifically these coming of age stories where I'm trying to go as deep into these characters' heads and into like this one insecurity or this one coping mechanism or what have you,
Mhm.
and kind of have them work through it. It's definitely changed me because it teaches me so much about myself and about my own coping mechanisms, my own issues. Like I said, I really wanted to write a people pleaser in
Mm.
Harriet because it's something I have only recently been coming to terms with, as far as like I've always known I was a people pleaser, but I didn't actually know how dangerous that could be. Like
Yeah.
how much that can really impact your life and your health and your well-being, and the people around you, your relationships, all of it. So it's just kind of like a really, really great way of journaling and like self-guided
Mm.
reflection and growth. And I think, yeah, reading is that too. It just is, you can do it in a lot shorter time.
I love that. I going back a little bit, I love what you said about kind of revamping or looking at chick lit, quote unquote chick lit, a
Right.
little bit more, um, being more engaged with it than a lot of other people might be.
Yeah.
And I feel like people have just kind of lost enthusiasm in media, which I know is a very blanket generalized statement, but I love that these books are just they deal with dark things, but they're just so full of hope and joy. And I'd love to know kind of why you think that's important, and maybe why both, almost like a two-sided question, because they're
Yeah.
not all negative, but they're not all positive either. And I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
approach to balancing both of those.
Yeah, I think that is, like we were saying, it's like one of the big misconceptions about the genre. There is a whole spectrum of romance, just like there is in any other genre, where you can't just make like too big of a generalization. But the oversimplification that you get so often from people who aren't immersed in this part of fiction and this community is that they're these very like simplistic, everything is happy, everybody's like everybody's doing great, nothing bad happens kinds of stories. And almost never is that the case. I'm sure that there are some like fluffier, lighter rom-coms out there, but in general, romances have conflict like any other book.
Mhm.
The difference really is that guaranteed happily ever after. And I've been thinking about this so much because I started reading romance and writing romance because I, like I said, was having kind of like the January experience of feeling
Mhm.
like the world suddenly is so blatantly dark and bleak and scary and
Mhm.
unpredictable. And I've always put so much faith and hope in people. And I'm looking around and I feel like the world is just kind of letting me down. I just thought that we were all a little bit like kinder and better than maybe we are like
Mhm.
as humans. Um, And I wrote Beach Read because I was wrestling with that and I wanted to find some kind of peace within the world as far as like, yes, there are these horrible things happening, and that's probably not going to stop anytime soon. But
Mhm.
even so, life is beautiful and worth living. And that's how I started this particular part of my writing journey was
Yeah.
wrestling with that exact thing. And that's also what drew me to reading this kind of book is specifically because these books are basically, by having that guaranteed happily ever after, it's not just a safe, comforting thing to read, which it is. And I think that's one of the reasons so many of us are reading them right now in a very uncertain time. But it's also just that by ending a story there, you're kind of saying that that was the point. And you can end a
Mm.
story at any point. And like literary fiction, which is even harder to describe or explain than other nebulous, confusing genres. But literary fiction, I feel like so much of what defines it is sort of like how you end the book. You're like, well, if it's all
Yeah.
wrapped up neatly, then that's not going to be literary fiction. And with a romance, it's like you're saying happily ever after. You're saying these two people are together and they are happy either for now or for the foreseeable future or forever, depending on the book. Um, and that doesn't mean that nothing bad is going to ever happen to those characters. It doesn't mean that one day one and then the other of them will die. Like it doesn't mean that that they're never going to fight, that they're never going to have really hard times, or just suffer great hurts. It's not saying any of
Mm.
that. It's just saying that the point of the story was this moment. The point of the
Mm.
story was the moment where love does conquer all and where these two people are blissfully happy. And to me, that's a beautiful message in a world where you don't get that very often to
Mm.
say that is the point of being here is to find those moments where you are blissfully happy loving someone and being loved by someone, whether that's romantic or otherwise. And I really do believe as much as there's like a point to anything, that's the point. For me, that's the point. For me, the point is being with the people you love on the planet Earth. um, so yeah, I think it's a genre that deserves a lot more respect because I think it's first of all very hard to write hopeful books, very hard to write funny books, but also just because I think that's a worldview that is worth holding on to.
Yes. Oh my gosh, you're gonna make me cry. That was so good.
I
So,
am impassioned about it, obviously.
as you should be. Your books are all set kind of in a vacation situation. What is your favorite vacation destination slash day off look like?
Ooh, favorite day off. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, what even is a day off at this point? I'm just like a nap is great. My favorite
Yeah.
vacation destination, I this is like kind of a cheat, but I for years have had kind of this standard trip that I take like as often as I can, like usually once every year, every couple of years,
Hmm.
where I fly to San Francisco and I go to Muir Woods, which is like the redwoods, and Muir Beach, which is just a beautiful, windy, cold beach near San Francisco, and then drive up through wine country and go wine tasting and be out in beautiful vineyards. And then I go up to visit my grandparents who live in Oregon. And there's like mountains, and usually you can drive up high enough
Yes.
that there's snow. And I love that I can just do all of that with like one flight. I can just get out
Yes.
there and see beautiful nature and see my grandparents who are like my favorite people, drink a bunch of wine. So that's kind of like the perfect trip to me is like all of that. And then a perfect day off, like I love sitting outside and reading in the sun with like an Aperol spritz and my dog.
Mm. That sounds like a great day. And since
Yes.
it's spring, hopefully you'll be able to do that more often
Very
now.
soon. Yeah, yeah.
So I won't ask you too many questions about your next book because I know we don't want to spoil anything. But
Mhm.
I do remember you said that it kind of reminds you of Karma from Midnights by Taylor
Mhm.
Swift. And you mentioned that the hero reminds you of your husband, if I remember correctly. Does the
Mhm.
heroine
Yeah.
kind of, well, I was going to say, does the heroine remind you of you? But you mentioned that they all remind you of
They
you at
all
different
do.
points. They all do.
Yeah, they do. They're my eras.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a little bit she does. And I think the specific way, the one thing, it's not like truly like a grumpy sunshine, but it's something kind of close to that where
Mm,
my husband is like the nice, like truly like s- the nicest person in the entire world. And I feel that I'm a very kind person, but I'm not like sweet. And I think
mm,
when people meet him first and then they meet me and I'm like a little bit sassy and kind of like brash and like mischievous and whatever, I think they're like kind of caught off guard because he's so like just nice and just like also so social, wants to talk to everyone. And I'm like a little bit more like I love hanging out with my friends, but I am like I don't know. So that's kind of like a
yeah.
fun dynamic. So it's not quite a grumpy sunshine, but it's something kind of close to that that I think is similar to my own relationship. And then as far as the karma element, yeah, I feel like it's basically like something really bad happens to you, but
Mm,
then everything, like, because of that, every, like, great thing in your life is just kind of clicking into
mm,
place, and hopefully it feels like, the wind in your hair on a weekend, like, that's kind of the vibe of
mhm.
the book.
Oh, I love that. I know, I feel like it's so hard to deal with dark things, but the darker it is, the harsher the contrast and the brighter the bright things are.
Yes.
So it's such a confusing
Yeah.
thing
Right.
to like be in the middle of.
Yeah, and to even be aware that you're like, "Okay, I'm watching good unfold directly out of something terrible that happened," but so often that is the way that it works, so
Yeah. So the last question before some just like a few rapid fire questions.
yeah.
Your stories offer us so much joy and your output has been consistent over these last few years. What is inspiring you or bringing you joy and creativity right now?
Oh, that's so nice. Well, I mean, really a huge part of it, like the reason that I'm able to sustain this output and that I think books have maintained quality they have, in my opinion, is the readers. Like that
Mm,
sounds like such a cheesy, like fake answer, but I genuinely, I mean, I was so scared the whole time I was working on Happy Place, and I was just pushing myself so hard and spent every spare second that I could trying to make this book the absolute best it could be. And I remember now, like when I removed myself from the haze of that, I remember that I felt the same way with book lovers. And now I've got this new book that I'm working on. And it feels like having this readership who is so generous and supportive and like just really excited and like really just great about like constantly sending me lovely messages and comments and engaging with me, having that really makes me want to keep making these books
hmm
because I'm just, like, so grateful for that, and then also, like I said, I started making these books because they were what I really needed for myself, and so the fact that they've become that for so many other people
mm,
is, like, really soul affirming. It feels like it's
yeah.
given me purpose in a way that a lot of times writing really has just been for me, and that's enough. I truly believe that can be enough, but right now I feel this sense of purpose where it feels like I'm able to bring some joy and and hope into other people's lives, and that keeps me going. And then the other thing that like really inspires me is like whenever I'm able to go on a trip that like
hmm
helps just on a literal just like brainstorming level, just like being able to
hmm
get to other places and be out in nature and yeah, feel the wind in your hair, like that kind of thing. When I feel something like that, like a really strong um like a, just like presence, like I'm being very present in a moment in my life, and I'm like taking in all of the stimuli, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, all of that. Then I'm
hmm
always like, ooh, I want to write. I want to like capture this and put it down into a book.
Oh, yes. So this last little bit is going to be kind of rapid fire esque. So you
Yeah.
can feel free to answer as long or as short as you might like.
All
What
right.
is on your writing playlist? If you have any music that you like to listen to when you
Ooh,
write.
I do not listen to music when I write because I'm so
Oh,
easily distracted.
That's very
If there's
valid.
yes, if there are lyrics, there's no way. I used to kind of put on classical music, but I haven't even if I know the song, like, I'm waiting for certain parts, I like sound is hard. Sound is hard when I'm writing, unfortunately.
Yes, no, I totally get that. How do you come up with character names and locations? I feel like those are so hard.
They are. They are. I think the thing that's helpful is you have to remember that all of your characters have different parents unless they're siblings.
Mm,
So the way that they would have been named would have had so much to do with what
mm,
how old their parents are, where their parents would have lived, what kind of people they are. Like, is it a family name? And if it's a family name, is it like a mother's maiden name or is it like a great aunt's first name, that kind of thing. And then also it really kind of helps that they all have to be different. And
yeah.
so like needing the variety of multiple syllables, how many syllables are in a name and whether they end with like a Y sound or an A sound or whatever, and what letter they start with, all of that helps kind of narrow it down a lot. But I'm definitely on nameberry.com a lot, like a lot of writers, just looking at very specific lists that will be like artistic girls' names from the 90s or whatever, just like
Yeah.
looking for ideas and then trying to not name them people after people that I actually know and talk to often. But eventually I'm going
Mhm.
to run out of other names and friends and family are going to start showing up.
You're gonna send a blast like email or something. This
Yeah.
doesn't, there's no
Yeah,
subtext to
it's
this.
not
Don't
about
worry.
you. Right, exactly. I'm always so paranoid about that, or that I'll forget somebody's, like, partner's name, and then, like, I'll be writing,
Mhm.
like, a love story where the love interest looks like a friend's, like, boyfriend and has the same name as him, like, that's
Oh,
I'm
no.
always so paranoid about that kinda thing, but so far so good.
We'll cross that bridge we get there.
Yeah.
Um, do you write during any particular time of day?
Yeah, usually I write morning through, like, afternoon, like, usually from, like, 10 to, like, 3, I write most
Mm.
days.
And do you have any favorite tropes that you, whether you like to write them or read them?
Yeah, I love reading, Marriage of Convenience in
Mm.
historical romance so much. That's one of my very favorites, and I do love Enemies to Lovers. I think I can be kind of picky about it, but when it's good, it's very, very good.
And finally, what has surprised you most about writing books?
Wow. That it doesn't get easier is probably
Oh,
my answer.
true.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm like, I would have really thought that it would get easier. And instead, it's sort of like, "Wait, have I already done this before?" Like, this is my
Mm,
first time writing a book, right? Yeah. That one.
yes. Yeah, it looks like that was my last question, but thank you
Awesome.
so much.